Forms with HTML, they allow us a way to collect user information. So it's designed to collect user input in various ways as well as handle user actions. So taking data that the user is able to submit and then doing something with the content that is submitted. To create a form, we wrap the contents, nest it within the form tag. So all of the content in the middle here is going to be part of this form, of this parent form element. And then we add in the various form elements to define what we're going to be doing with the form. The most common and probably the most important one to use is the input. And this allows us to create a single line of input content. And there's various types of inputs. So we can specify the input as text. This allows us to collect text input information. There's also an input and type radio button, and there's checkbox, color, date, date time, and we're going to be going through some of these as well. So most commonly there's the text, there's also radio buttons, and there's also submit button. And this is going to create a submit button for the contents of our form. So when we refresh, we've got our input form field and submit. Now with the attributes, this is how we define the different types of inputs. And immediately it's not clear what this input is requiring. It's just a text input, and the user can come and add in whatever text they want, and they hit submit, and this is going to submit the form. Where it's submitting the form, we can specify that within the form attributes themselves. So we can select the method that we want to use for the form submission. This is either get or post. So for now, we'll do get, and I'll also show you what post is going to do. So let's save that, refresh, and we'll type some content in here, test, submit. And what happened is that it actually ended up submitting the content to itself, to the same page that we were on, because we didn't specify the destination, the action of where it's supposed to be submitting that content to. And there was just a question mark because, again, we didn't specify a name for this input field. And that's how it's typically identified wherever you're submitting the content to. You enter in a name for those fields in order for that content to be received. So now when I refresh it and I type in some content like test and I hit submit, now within the URL, we see that it says first equals test. So first is referring to the name of the input field and test is referring to the value that was entered there. Let's create another text input field, and this one will add the value of the name of last. We'll refresh and test first and test last. And when we hit submit, we're creating within the URL request, we've got a value for first test plus first because we've got a space there, and sign because this is stringing together the number of different values that we're passing within the request URL. And then for the value of last, which is referring to the second input field, we've got a value of test last. So whatever information you put in here, this is what is going to be registered within the request value. So now we've updated the value of first to equal test, first, test, test, first, test, and last equals test plus last. We still don't have any indication what we want to use and what type of input we're expecting for these fields. So it is important to label your fields. So you can do it with just the label above it and just plain HTML. And then there's also last, so that we're specifying within the text input what type of values we're expecting. And we'll also add in another line break at the end. And now we've got a basic form structure. You can also transform these into labels. We need to, within the attributes, we specify what the label is for. And this is going to be referencing and it defines it's the label tag. It defines a label for the form elements. This is also very useful for screen reader users because the screen reader will read aloud the label content for the user once they focus on that input. And the for attribute within the label is going to refer to the ID attribute of the input. So that's where we need to add in an ID. And oftentimes for the inputs, you're going to find that those values are the same. So there is some consistency within the way that we're structuring the inputs, where we're adding in the label content, and then between the label tags, we could specify that this is requesting a first name, and we'll do the same for last. And don't forget to update and add in the ID attribute for the other input field as last, so that we know that we're referencing that particular field. So we refresh it. So we don't actually see much of a difference or any difference between what the output is, but this is more properly formatted within the HTML and it's ready for the screen readers. There's also an option for within the input fields. We can also use placeholder. So this is also commonly used, and this will create a grayed out value within first, and then you can enter in contents within the input field. And you can also add it into the value for the input last. And this is all done with the attributes. So now we've got the placeholder content is in place, and this is giving the user more of an indication of what value they can expect and what value they should be inputting into that element. You can also use different tags in order to wrap around the various inputs. So this again is another way to create more structure. So you can use the div tags to apply a block format, which will move it to the next line. So each one of these will be allowed to have their own line for the content. And then we have the submit button here at the bottom. And there's a number of different combinations of ways to set up your form and to structure your form. And there's one last attribute that we wanted to add to the form value. And this is a default value for the input field. So notice when I refresh it, it's going to add the default value into the field. So we're no longer going to be able to see the placeholder content, but this is already holding a default value. So when we do make the submission, it's going to pass that default value. Whereas the placeholder content is still blank and it's still seen as blank content. And this is if you do have some default value that you want the input fields to start with, you can add them in as values within the input fields. So coming up next, we're going to look at some different types of inputs as well as other tags that are commonly used within forms. So for the challenge for this exercise is to go ahead, open up your editor and create a simple couple input fields that are just regular text input fields that are asking for first and last name, and then the submit button. Try it out, submit your form contents, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson.